I am going to be showing you how to do a monoprint, and then I'm also going to show you a couple of issues that you might run into and how you can take care of these things. So basically with a monoprint, what you can do, you can get an image online or you can sketch an original image. For this one, either way would be just fine. The point of this is just to get the hang of the technique and not necessarily have to make something that's going to take you an incredible amount of time. So in this case, what I did was I just went to Google Images and found an image of Mother Mary and little baby Jesus, and went ahead and printed that, sized it up to the size of the tile that I wanted to make. And here I have a 4 1/4 inch cookie cutter, and then this little guy is a 3 1/4 inch cookie cutter. So you want to make sure that you size it up according to what size you're ultimately going to want. Now, one thing that I did as a goof up, I accidentally forgot to change my image from black to gray, like I've done on this one here. And the reason you want to change your image from black to gray is that sometimes the glaze does not want to stick to the piece of paper because the printer ink is super high gloss. One thing that you might see if you don't change it is you'll get what I have here, which if you look at my little piece of paper, you can kind of see the glaze is actually starting to flake off of the piece of paper. So by changing the color or the grayscale of it, it won't be as intense, it won't be as much ink, so hopefully it won't do what mine did. So then all you have to do is you take these little slip trail bottles and you're gonna basically just trace right over top of your image. So this technique is probably the easiest of the 4 that we're gonna do. This one's the monoprint. We also have the wax resist, which I'll show you in another video. And I also have the sgraffito and then the Mishima. So for this one, we're just focusing on the monoprint. You just want to okay, so what I've done is taken the slip trail bottles. You can choose multiple colors. I just chose black. You can choose whatever color you want. We are using a red clay for this, so you would want to use a clay or a glaze that would have a little bit of contrast. This clay will fire up not quite as dark as it is right now. And you're just going to go over the paper image with your slip trail bottle. I would recommend having a scrap piece of paper towel handy because every now and then these slip trail bottles do kind of fart out just a little bit. Now, like I said, your paper can curl up, so I'm going to show you a little trick. You can actually take a little water bottle and give it a little baby spritz. You don't want to go crazy with the water because, of course, paper will eventually break down, and then I can very gently kind of pat that bad boy back down, and hopefully Mother Mary's eyebrow doesn't get out of hand. You can take a little pin and kind of push that back down. Now this one, her eyebrow actually came totally off, so I'm actually going to peel that away and just get rid of it, and then I can redraw it because this might be more of a hassle. Just get rid of that. So if you have anything that kind of goes rogue and decides to peel off, you might just get rid of it and then redo it if it starts to curl way too much. Alright, so then I would want to double check. Oh, I forgot little baby Jesus' eyeball. That's kind of important. This is a jumping off point, so this does not have to be perfect, but you do want to try to get the majority of the information that you intend on transferring. This is what happens if you try to transfer your paper too soon. So if your glaze has not thoroughly dried before you transfer it, then you're going to get this, which is not ideal. Okay, so you need to make sure that you have a good quality image, number one, not too complex, but also not too simple. Give yourself a little bit of a challenge. So what I've done on here is I've traced over the image. Remember, you want to make sure that you change your image from black ink to gray ink so that it will not repel the glaze as we go to paint over top of it. Think of this just like coloring. So we're going to be taking this image and I'm actually going to be transferring it onto this tile. But one thing that you might end up seeing is that these little pieces of glaze like to flake off after they start to dry. So I'm actually going to put the piece of paper down and I'm going to flip the tile over on top of it. But if you transfer the piece of paper with glaze too soon to the tile, it'll actually squish the glaze and it'll make a big old mess. So you want to make sure that the timing is just right. You need to figure out what size you are going to have, whether it be the larger tile being a 4 1/4 inch circular cookie cutter, or this one is also the same size. This is the guy. This one is 3 1/4 inch, or you can use the tile roller, which will cut a perfect 4 inch by 4 inch square. So you just need to decide that before you get started. You also need to decide if you are going to need to flip the image. If the image has any words or text or anything that would be relevant that would be flipped in reverse, that's really important. Think of this like a rubber stamp. So this is a B stamp. However, when you look at it before it's pressed into the clay, it looks like a D because I'm going to be pushing that down and making an impression. So it's the same thing with taking the image and essentially flipping it over and stamping it onto the clay. So think about if you need to have your image reversed. Once you have your image transferred like this one here, then you can think about going back with some glaze and you can actually kind of color in the lines. However, what I would recommend is actually bisque firing this first, and then once it's been bisque fired, all this glaze that you see is permanent. Then if you want to add another color later or several colors and you goof up and you need to sponge away, you won't accidentally smear away any of this black coloring book line because it's already been fired. So that would be a benefit of actually firing this in 2 steps, bisque firing this first and then going back and then adding additional glazes later. So I have my image glazed over. It's just a clip art from online. I went ahead and applied black and white glaze. You can't really see the white glaze so much because it's on white paper. And then I let it thoroughly dry. If it's not drying, you can take the hair dryer to it or the heat gun on low heat, but you have to be really careful doing the heat gun. Obviously, you can catch your paper on fire, which would not be good. You can use the hair dryer. Just be patient with it. If you use the heat gun, it can also curl your page, so you want to be pretty patient. This one, I already transferred it, and then I added a couple of holes using the hole punch so that I could turn it into a Christmas ornament. I think this is sufficient for the color for right now because I can always go back and add more color after it's been bisque fired. If I did that right now, I run the risk of messing up my black glaze, so I want to be patient and maybe come back and do that later on. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and transfer my anchor onto this little tile. Remember, if your glaze starts peeling off of the paper, you want to be really careful. What you can do is actually put the paper down and you can flip the tile on top of it. I have my cooler right here, so if I did that, I might have a hard time picking this up. So what I'm gonna do is, just to show you on the video, I'm just gonna go ahead and gently flip this piece of paper over. I don't have anything curling right now, so then I can just kind of move it and line it up. I don't see any glaze curling off, so I think I'm good. I'm gonna offset it just a little bit instead of making it perfectly symmetrical. I think that could look kind of cool. It might be a disaster, but I won't know till I try. So I'm gonna very gently go ahead and push this down, and then I'm gonna burnish the back side of it. So burnishing is where you push with the back side, push the back side of the paper with like a firm object. You don't want to go like super sharp. These are skizzers, so you want to be kind of careful with how hard you push. You can also use your fingernail. If your clay is a little on the firm side, your transfer may not want to work. So what I could have done is maybe add just a slightly damp sponge to the back of it to help it release, or I could have very barely spritz the glaze to try to see if it'll release. And I hope I just didn't shift my paper. If you shift your paper, then you run the risk of the image not lining up. and then you might have to start over. You can smooth the image off of the clay by using a wet sponge, so you don't have to totally ditch your whole tile. And I'm holding it down with my left hand while I'm kind of scratching with my fingernail. My clay is a little firm, so if your clay was squishy and you did this with your fingernail or the scissors, you would gouge the clay, so you just got to be really careful. You can use the backside of a metal spoon, also works. And very barely, I'm going to start to peel it up just to see if I'm getting a transfer, and it looks like it's transferring. Yay! If you're not getting a transfer, then you could try again slightly, and I mean barely, dampen a sponge just ever so slightly. It'll break down the paper, so you got to be careful not to leave it on too long. I'm just dabbing it, dab. And then I'm just gonna burnish with my fingernail, because remember, my clay is kind of firm. If your clay's squishy, don't use your fingernail. Don't use a sharp tool. You could use the backside of a metal spoon, which are over in a drawer on the clay tool shelf. And I'm just trying to get as much of that glaze off of the paper as possible. You're not gonna get all of it off. Probably maybe like half of it will actually come off of the paper. So you might have to do 2 or 3 coats of glaze. And then whatever you do, don't peel your paper away all the way until you make sure that your glaze actually transferred to the best of your liking. This little spot's not showing up, so I'm going to burnish a little bit more. Here we go. And then if there's a certain stubborn spot, you can always just go back with your glaze bottle. You can also use the back side of your fingernail. Really anything that's firm will do. Getting most of it's coming off, which is good. Yay! Now if your glaze starts curling off of your tile, you may have to give it a baby spritz and then dab it with your finger. You want to be really careful if you dab it with a sponge, because you can actually wipe it away. You don't want that. And if your paper starts breaking down and you're afraid you're totally going to screw it up, you could just do the best you can, peel it off, and any of that paper pulp that might still be there, that'll burn away in a firing. And then just be sure you don't peel your paper away until you're absolutely positive that you're happy with your transfer. Now I've peeled it away, so it's not gonna I'm not gonna be able to line it back up. I'm pretty happy with that transfer. It's got a little bit of weird texture to it, but I like that. After I bisque fire it, I could go back and I could touch up anything. I can also take my little squirty bottle right now. Hopefully this doesn't backfire, because sometimes it can backfire. Very barely I can follow the impression, because I can see an indentation of where the glaze was. It just didn't transfer there, and I'm just barely giving a little dab, and then maybe like right here, and then I think I could go ahead and finish the side of this, and that's that. Not too shabby. Just be careful, don't overdo it. You want to just kind of get the general information, and then you can always go back after it's been bisque fired and you can add some more color, you can touch up anything. And like I said, after it's been bisque fired, if I goof up and I sponge away, my anchor won't go anywhere because it's already been bisque fired. If I sponge away right now, I'm totally going to smear my glaze. So just keep that in mind. One more thing to keep in mind: when you go to stack these up in your cooler, whatever you do, don't stack an image that has glaze on it. So I would not want to put this little guy on top of this. Otherwise, I run the risk of that glaze coming off on there, and it might not be desirable. I might totally ruin this. So once you start having images on your clay, you want to avoid stacking your tiles. You want to keep them side by side, and remember, you want to leave a little bit of a ring around the edge to allow for the inner rim of the cooler to actually fit down inside of here. So you might need to have more than one cooler, or you might need to actually just wrap these individually and put them in your art locker. But beware, you don't want to wrap this in a Kroger bag if your glaze is wet, because that's going to backfire as well. So you've got to be patient. You got to plan ahead. You may want to share a cooler with a friend that's got like a really big cooler, so you can kind of keep these things nice and fresh. Another thing you can do is you can actually take a Ziploc bag, put this in the Ziploc bag, zip it about 80% shut, blow into the Ziploc bag like a balloon, and then zip it shut, so it'll actually make a dome of air around your tile, and you can avoid the bag actually settling on top of your clay.